Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
I want to welcome you all to the Wade Center podcast. We are here today with Dr. Philip Ryken, the president of Wheaton College, to interview him about his 2017 book, The Messiah Comes to Middle Earth. Thanks, Dr. Ryken, for joining us. We're delighted at the success of the book, which is already in its fourth printing and is being translated into Portuguese. Thank you.
Yeah, so I didn't know it was in its fourth printing, so that's encouraging right there. It's great to be here at the Wade Center, which is such an amazing place to visit. And so grateful to you, Crystal and David, for agreeing to be co-directors of the Wade Center and for starting this podcast, which is, I think, really going to be beneficial to our listeners.
Yes, we have gotten great response to it. And I want to start our conversation by asking you, what led you to decide to write about Tolkien for this book project?
Well, we were so thrilled when Walter and Darlene Hansen decided to sponsor the Hansen lectures here at Wheaton College. And the idea was to get our faculty better exposed to the resources of the Wade Center. And they wanted to promote the thing, so they asked me if I might do the kickoff lectures for this. And I had been thinking about the prophethood, priesthood, and kingship of Jesus Christ as it relates to leadership, specifically presidential leadership, because I was working on a faith and learning paper, which our faculty typically do at the beginning of their time at Wheaton. And I started thinking about, is there a way to connect those themes with resources at the Wade Center? I thought about actually working a little bit with Dorothy Sayers, Man Born to be King. But then in the end, the more I thought about The Lord of the Rings, I thought I can really develop all three of these themes in conversation with Tolkien, and that's where I landed at the end of this.
That's interesting you brought up The Man Born to be King, because as I read your book, I was struck by your construct of the difference between the threefold office of Christian leadership versus just three offices. And it reminded me of Sayers' Trinitarian view of creativity. And I'm wondering if you had thought about that?
I'd have to think about that. What I will say is that the Bible gives us thematic structures that have wide applicability. And I think the prophetic, priestly, and kingly ministry of Jesus Christ is like that. But the more we can think theologically, multidimensionally, the better. And I think that's one of the strengths of Dorothy Sayers' theology, that she thinks in a very Trinitarian way.
Yes.
This isn't quite the same thing. I mean, I don't know how it's connected, other than I think when you start thinking through these theological structures, they bear a lot of fruit. And I think probably you could show that one of the strengths of the Wade authors generally is they're not one-dimensional, they're multidimensional, including in their theological thinking.
Let's give them another idea for a book, The Mind of the Leader, where you take her paradigm. Because the leader comes up with an idea and then tries to figure out how to implement the idea and then receives a response to the idea. I think we've got a whole other lecture series here.
So I'm always looking for good ideas for projects, so that's a great one.
Well, and I was thinking of that in terms of the theology of modalism. And by Sayers focusing on the Trinity, the three are one. And you quote Richard Mouw talking about leadership, the three are one. Prophet, priest, and king. And when you have imbalance in leadership, it's because one of those three comes to dominate the other important manifestations of being a Christian leader.
Yeah, I think there's something just to maybe characteristic of the mind of God, that there is balance and symmetry and harmony. And so when you have something like prophetic, priestly, and kingly ministry of Jesus Christ, if you get those things out of balance, you don't have the divine intent. You don't have the biblical harmony. And the same is true in the Trinity. Some of the imbalances we get into theologically, one aspect of God's character or work is emphasized maybe more so than it should be in relationship to the others. And the Bible is always trying to draw us back to that balance. And so this, I think we want to do that. I think, and this is one of the areas where we want to do that with our own agency and calling as prophets, priests, and kings in the lowercase as part of our fulfillment of our Christian calling.
One of the things I have read about the Methodist movement, and I understand that Wheaton was started as a Wesleyan institution.
It was. So this was a Methodist institution until the Methodists didn't want to pay for it
No.
anymore. And so then at that point we said, well, we'll have an independent board, and this will be for really multi-denominational.
Right. The reason I brought them up is I have read that they re-infused conversation about the Holy Spirit, that discussion of the Holy Spirit in terms of acknowledging the Trinity had been not emphasized as much, especially in the Anglican tradition.
I was interested in, once again, those three offices. As I was reading Lord of the Rings in the light of your book, I was also thinking about the suffering servant being not quite an office, but a role that Christ played, and certainly it comes up in Lord of the Rings with Frodo. Did you got that paradigm from Eusebius originally? He's the one who came up with the three offices.
The prophetic, priestly, and kingly ministry of Jesus Christ, there's a vast legacy of that just in Christian theology, and maybe even more so than I realized when I started the project. I was aware that as far as we know, Eusebius was the first person to use this as a theological framework. So that's going back, 3rd century, his ecclesiastical history. He actually starts with, here are the anointed offices of the Christ, which, by the way, are anointed offices from the Old Testament. And this is a way for him to understand and articulate the person and work of Jesus Christ in really taking a kind of redemptive historical approach, looking at the whole of Scripture, how all of this is pointing to Christ in these three offices. But you see it in medieval theology, you see it in the Reformers, you see it in post-Reformation theology. I didn't really know anything about Methodist tradition in this, but I started talking to some people that knew a lot more about Methodism than I do, and it's arguable that this structure, when Wesley comes to, I'm here in the Wade Center, so Lewis is always your default author. When Wesley, put together his pastoral theology, you can show that this is really a dominant structure for him, and right up into, interestingly enough, not only Anglican theology, but Roman Catholic theology. And I touch on that a little bit through the book, not giving the complete history, but giving enough of it so that people can see this is really, because it's biblical, it shows up in all the Christian traditions.
Right.
One of the things I want to compliment you about is the complexity of your book structure, because you are citing the Bible, church history, Tolkien, and then interweaving all of those with the idea of Christian leadership. And yet you maintain a lucid prose style. And it never becomes turgid or opaque, and that's one of the greatest compliments I can give to a writer. And one of the things I really valued that you did in this book was to honor Tolkien's recognition of the poetics of language. Tolkien loved the way the names of characters sounded, and you honored that not only by quoting some of the poems from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but also you would do things like you would be talking about Aragorn, and you would say, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and you would honor the poetry of the sound of Tolkien's language.
Yeah,
is that something intentional?
Sure, yeah. So first of all, those are very generous comments. Thank you for that. So one of the things that it prompts for me is remembering hearing Humphrey Carpenter lecture on Tolkien in England when I was a boy. And one of the things he talked about is just his love for the Welsh language and how he loved language from his earliest days. So honestly, one of the things I wanted to do in these lectures, we wanted these lectures to be entertaining. We wanted to, attract student interest. And the book came out of 3 lectures that I gave here on campus. What are you going to do when you're lecturing on Tolkien? You want to read as much Tolkien as possible as part of the lecture. So that was intentional. Interestingly, the poetry parts, I did not have a great love for those as a child. Poetry, you have to learn how to love poetry. At least for me, I had to learn how to love poetry. But one thing is true, and C.S. Lewis talks about this as well. I try to hear the words that I'm writing. And I think as a preacher, I have an advantage with that because I'm always thinking about how things are going to sound. So I am attentive to the rhythm of sentences and the rhythm of words. And even though that's something oral, A-U-R-A-L, it also, I think, improves literary style to be thinking about rhythm. So maybe some of that's, but certainly your comments are very generous, Crystal. But the other thing I'll say is that I love historical theology. I love Tolkien. I love thinking about leadership and love thinking about particularly how the whole theology of the Bible comes to its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. So I wanted all of those elements to be part of this book and work them in, hopefully in a way that was coherent.
I noticed you were careful to use the word applicability rather than allegory. Both Lewis and Tolkien had their problems with allegory, especially Tolkien, because people were saying Sauron must be Hitler and maybe Saruman is Mussolini, and obviously Gondor and Rowan must be America and Britain. And so he, right in the front of the book, he says, I like history, real or feigned, rather than allegory. And so, but he did say there's room for applicability on the part of the reader rather than an allegorical reading which has been implanted by the author. And so I noticed that in your book you quoted some of his letters and comments that would give you permission to attach specific roles to the characters in a way that I don't think he was thinking of particularly when he wrote the story.
Yeah, so no, that's a great comment and question. One thing I'll say, and I need to say this somewhere in the podcast, I definitely do not claim to be a Tolkien scholar. So, but actually that's the point of these lectures is for somebody that's working in another area to come benefit from the riches of the Wade Center. And I wanted to be careful in approaching this project, not to make more of these images of Christ, as I call them, than the books themselves really warranted. So really the starting point for me was a careful read through The Lord of the Rings, which, by the way, I mean, what a great project to assign to yourself. Yes, let me do this lecture project where I must read The Lord of the Rings and pay careful attention this summer. So, I mean, that was just, a real benefit of all of this. But as I read more in Tolkien's letters about how he thought about issues of allegory and applicability, I became more confident that the kind of reading I was giving was not only an appropriate reading in and of itself, but actually that as time went on, Tolkien would have recognized, I think, the validity of this kind of reading. He talks, for example, about wanting to give the reader freedom of applicability, and he does have critical comments to make about allegory, which I partly think he means the kind of book where there is a one-to-one correspondence between a character and maybe something specific from Christian doctrine. And that's definitely not the claim I'm making in my book. That's something more like, Pilgrim's Progress would refer to. But I think he also was wanting to be careful about having a book which was woodenly trying to translate Christian doctrine or Christian themes in a way that didn't have integrity to the story itself. Right. And that's what he was particularly concerned about. Interestingly, though, he talks about the allegory and the story becoming one in one of his writings. He talks about how we are all allegories because our life itself is a story which is rooted in God's story. So there's an aspect of finding Christian truth and Christian meaning, which I think is inescapable. And I think Tolkien increasingly recognized that. And if I can just say one more thing on this theme, one of the really interesting discoveries for me was this essay by Gordon from Newcastle University in Australia, where back in the 60s, he was saying, hey, prophet, priest, and king, there's really something here. His essay was never published, but this is why you have archives, because it's in the Newcastle Archive and it's available here at the Wade Center. And
you found it here at the Wade?
It's here in the Wade Center. And interestingly, I don't know exactly how it happened. Presumably, Professor Gordon sent his essay to Tolkien. He thought he might find it interesting. So Kilby, in his Silmarillion book, recounts Tolkien walking in with this paper in hand saying, hey, here's this, person with this idea. And what is Tolkien? I can pull out my copy here. Tolkien says, there's something to this. Much of this is true enough. Much of this, meaning there are prophetic, priestly, and kingly motifs in The Lord of the Rings, except, of course, the general impression given. almost irresistibly in articles having this analytical approach, whether by Christians or not, that I had any such schema in my conscious mind before or during the writing. So, Tolkien saying, actually, I can see that there's truth in this, but like, don't think that this is what I had in mind. I was doing this deliberately,
Right.
which is fair enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a lot of authors would respond similarly. There's a famous story about Saul Bellow where he was at a book signing and somebody came up to him and said, "Oh, your recent novel, it just seems to be about the despair of the 20th century male. Is that what you intended?" And Bellow responded, "No, that's not what I intended. But you're right. That's what it's about."
And the reason it's about that is because he himself is
Of
a 20th
course.
century
Right.
male.
Yes.
Right.
And I think the same is true of Tolkien. So his sensibilities about Christian friendship, which correlate strongly with priesthood of all believers concepts, come through very strongly in his whole approach to the hobbits. His love, not just for kingship, but for monarchy and kingship of a particular kind, comes through very strongly in his admiration for Aragorn. Now, why did Tolkien have some of those sensibilities? Because he was a deeply Christian man whose values also were formed by Scripture. So there's a coherence of all of these things that really come together.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. The kingship is pretty easy to see because Aragorn really deserves to be the king. And it's interesting as you follow the story that Boromir and his family, they're only the stewards of Gondor. And as you follow their character, Boromir's brave and he's a good fighter, but he's impetuous and he doesn't understand the danger of the ring. I think they missed a step in the movie because they have one of the hobbits throw a stone outside of the Mines of Moria. In the book, it's Boromir that does that. And he also blows his horn when he leaves Rivendell, and Elrond says, "You probably shouldn't do that. There's a lot of enemies around." So there are a lot of clues that Boromir is not quite the perfect character to be a king, whereas Aragorn consistently uses good judgment and does the right thing. The role I think that to me is a harder sell is Frodo as a priest because of the priesthood of all believers. As a Roman Catholic author, we just talked about how Tolkien doesn't necessarily have to endorse your interpretation, but could you speak to the Frodo role?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. So first of all, I actually think Frodo and the priesthood of all believers became an easier sell to me the deeper I got into the novel, because it was striking to me how many times it is said of the hobbits that they just cannot do anything by themselves. They're so attached to one another. I mean, at the beginning of the novel, Frodo assumes he's going to go off to Mordor by himself. His friends think that's absurd. It's laughable. It is just inconceivable that you would attempt any great quest on your own. The more dangerous it is, of course, the more likely it is that your friends will go on the quest with you. And of course, Samwise Gamgee particularly, demonstrates that all the way to the end. So actually, its presence in the novel became stronger to me as I went through. But you raise a fair point, because I think most people do not associate the priesthood of all believers, let alone prophethood and kingship, but particularly priesthood of all believers, with Roman Catholic theology. And it may well be the case that this was not a category that was strong in Tolkien's own mind. However, and I'm not sure this is in the book, it's in some of the other writing that I've done, there's a strong section on the prophethood, priesthood, and kingship of all believers in the Roman Catholic Catechism, this Roman Catholic Catechism of recent decades. And Yves Congar is one of the theologians that much more popularized, particularly the priesthood of all believers. So I think the more biblical the Roman Catholic theology is, the more it becomes apparent that we actually have burden-bearing intercessory responsibilities for one another as followers of Christ, which is not entirely mediated through a priest that has the title and calling of priest. I don't know enough about Roman Catholic theology to understand all the sources that are coming into that. I would say the more biblical Roman Catholic theology is, the more a theme like this is going to come to the fore. But I would also say that because this goes back to Eusebius, because it goes back to the early church, because you have in Aquinas at least kingship and priesthood coming together, There actually are sources within the Roman Catholic tradition that were probably de-emphasized in the Reformation and post-Reformation period and somewhat have been recovered. So I think if Tolkien didn't recognize this, would not have recognized this as a Roman Catholic emphasis, I think some Roman Catholics would say, but he should have, because this is actually something that can be important in Roman Catholic theology as well.
And in fact, Jennifer McNutt, in her response to your second lecture, I believe it was, listed various Catholic theologians who would have had a similar construct of the priesthood of believers.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because people that are listening to this podcast absolutely should know we are doing these Hansen lectures every year, and we're live streaming them, and in partnership with InterVarsity Press, we're publishing them. And one of the really great ideas, and I can't remember, this may have been Walter Hansen's idea, might have been Marge Mead's idea, to have, after each lecture, a brief response from a faculty member. So that adds to the multidisciplinary dialogue around this. And of course, for those who don't, I mean, Jennifer McNutt is just, she's a world-class Reformation scholar, and one nice thing about working on Tolkien, it wasn't hard to find faculty members that wanted to engage with things from Tolkien, because a lot of people love Tolkien. So it really enriches the book to have Sandra Richter and Jennifer McNutt and Bill Struthers contributing to it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading your book is Tolkien's choice of the place name Middle Earth, because he tends to avoid appropriating elements from literary tradition, and yet Middle Earth comes straight out of medieval drama. So I went to look it up, and the famous York play about the fall of Adam and Eve actually has this line, and we're talking in the 1470s, that when God is throwing Adam and Eve out of the garden, he says, "Now cherubim, mine angel bright, to Middle Earth go drive these two." Do you have any thoughts as to why Tolkien would break his own rules about appropriating something from literary tradition?
Yeah, so that's probably something you'd have to ask a real Tolkien scholar. So I think what's interesting about the phrase Middle Earth is you can think of it in a physical or geographical sense. So it's kind of a clever term in that sense. You can't quite locate it in this world, but it seems to be in this world, but it's not quite in this world. You can also think about it in a temporal sense. And Tolkien was very clear that this is a pre-Christian. This is sort of the world not yet fallen and redeemed. And so you can think of middle as a sort of temporal term as well. It'd be interesting to know, and I think Tolkien doesn't he comment somewhere about, I think there are some things that he says about the term Middle Earth that aren't just coming to mind for
Right,
me.
he does. It's an Anglo-Saxon term. He actually uses it in his translation of Sir Gawain. He says throughout Middle Earth. It's perfect for England in the oldest sense. It just means between heaven and hell, the above, below, and we're in the middle. But he also added that it's somewhat like Europe. He wanted the legendarium, the Lord of the Rings, and all of his stories to be this mythic project for England, the way Finland has the Kalevala. And the English tend to think they're just right. They're not too far north to have too much snow. He comments on it. They only got a little bit of snow in the Shire, but they're not too far south to be. But they're certainly not Europe and all its entanglements, but they're not America. They're an island off of Europe. So there's something perfectly English about the concept of Middle Earth.
It's a non-extreme title,
Right.
Middle Earth.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
Anglicans say, let's just get right in the middle theologically. It all seems to fit together.
It's like Newton said, I am a sort of middleman. And that's very characteristic of Anglicanism.
Right.
Did you first read Tolkien when it was a rage as you were an adolescent. I mean, it was a rage when I was an adolescent.
It's still a rage, I thought.
Yeah, that's true.
Hopefully it still is. So
What's wrong?
so I probably my mother first read me Lord of the Rings. I read The Hobbit in third grade, I remember. And I read Lord of the Rings at least once a year, through my sort of late elementary, adolescent years. I remember one year when we were in England for the summer, we got really nice hardback copies, and I devoured those that summer. And I'm reading Lord of the Rings right now to my youngest daughter. So, they're great to come back to again and again.
How's your Elvish?
My Elvish. So I know no Elvish. I had, when the movies came out, we had a very, excited group of parishioners at our church in Philadelphia. And they wanted to have a big, go at midnight when the first movie comes out or whatever. And I said I would go on two conditions. One, that nobody dressed up as an orc, and that anybody who spoke in Elvish would please translate. So,
I wanted to go back to the roles of the different characters. You talk about Gandalf being the prophetic role. What struck me is the obvious idea of prophecy. He can see ahead, at least in a misty fashion. He can see where things are headed. And he has a very strong intuition that Gollum needs to stay in the picture in some way. And certainly he did need to stay in the picture. When I took Old Testament back at Westmont, the professor always said, well, a prophet is not just a foreteller, but a forthteller. And he always emphasized it's not just about foretelling the future. It's about speaking to the present. And as I was reading your book, it struck me that he's a prophet in both senses. When he goes to Rowan, he needs to straighten out their social order and speak to what's going on in that society. So he's not just telling about the future. He's very much talking about the present.
No, I think biblical prophecy is multidimensional that way. You see that in the Old Testament prophets. You definitely see it in the prophetic ministry of Jesus Christ. So he's telling you sometimes uncomfortable truths about yourself, and about the culture that you live in. But Jesus also has, prophetic discourses that are foretelling the future. And I think you do see both of those elements in Gandalf. And one of the things when he meets his untimely death, or so it seems, one of the things that then becomes a problem for the Fellowship of the Ring, and Aragorn feels it very keenly, is that they've lost the guidance, the discernment, the wisdom. And it's not just, helping you understand the future. It's actually helping you understand, the calling of the present moment. And Gandalf can be relied on for both of those kinds of wisdom. And I think he fits a kind of Old Testament character type as a result.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I also thought of romantic literature as I was reading your book. In fact, I think we could do a whole book series on Romanticism and the seven authors, by which I mean British Romanticism. And what I was thinking of is Keats's famous line about how we hate poetry that has a palpable design on us. And I think Tolkien shared that. He didn't want to write something that had a palpable design on, okay, I'm going to make you think in a certain way. And then Keats also talks about something he calls negative capability, where the author can reside in doubt, mystery, and uncertainty. And I was struck that, as you discussed Tolkien, that is precisely what he's doing, because we can't always anticipate where he is going with his narrative, especially that incident of Frodo coming to throw the ring into the cracks of doom, right? And so we all think, oh, here's the denouement, yay! And he can't do it, and instead Gollum bites off the finger.
Spoiler alert, by the way. So sorry if you haven't read Lord of the Rings yet. So,
but that illustrated to me that Tolkien just wanted to not have a palpable design, not give us what we think is going to happen. And that also occurred to me, too, in how he delays the wedding between Aragorn and his Arwen.
Arwen Evenstar.
Right.
Yeah. So, and I think that what you're describing, Crystal, I think matches what you often hear from those who write novels, that there's a process of discovery that goes. So I suppose there's certain kinds of authors, maybe detective novelists probably have to do this, where you have the whole thing mapped out. But and it'd be interesting. I mean, I've never read anything. Maybe this is in some of the letters, but by the time you get to the end, that is the right ending, but it is a shock ending. At least it was for me my first time through. But it has a certain inevitability when you see how greatly Frodo had fallen under the temptations of the ring, and everything you've learned about the ring teaches you to expect that it dominates somebody, that you are not able to destroy it. It's very much in keeping for Gollum to grasp for something. I mean, it is the right ending, but there is, you don't anticipate it, but then when you look back, you see that the kind of inevitability to it. I definitely agree with what you were saying about you don't want to be practiced upon by a poet or a novelist. And I remember, for example, as a child, how annoying it was to have a parent who shall remain nameless, one of my parents, kind of pointing out things to you to make sure you weren't missing kinds of things. Like, just enjoy the story and you'll make those discoveries. And the really great stories, and, Lewis and Tolkien both, this was very much part of their sensibility as readers. You go back to those great stories and you discover things that you hadn't noticed before. And I find that very much with Lord of the Rings. There are things I notice, as a parent I didn't understand as a child. And that's part of the richness of discovery. But you don't get those kind of discoveries in the kind of book where an author is practicing upon you. You only get them in stories that are rich, richly textured, multidimensional, and have a surplus of meaning rather than a narrowly focused meaning.
When you go to a writer's workshop, they always talk about avoid the missing theme. We read the story and we go, what's the point? But the other is the intrusive theme.
Yeah.
And beginning writers especially, they want to make sure they drive the point home in a way that's annoying to the reader. You talked about his deciding on the ending. What's amazing about Tolkien was his process. For J.K. Rowling, she had a 7-foot sheet of shelf paper, and she sketched out all 7 novels and the character arcs and the story arcs. Tolkien says, well, I'm going to write this great epic, and he didn't plan ahead. When the hobbits got to Bree, he says, I didn't really know who Strider was. I'm going to have to figure out. He didn't know at that point that was the king. And when Faramir showed up, he didn't know what Faramir's story was going to be. And even the very ending, someone wrote and said, why did they celebrate Frodo as a hero? Because he failed. He got to the point where he had to put the ring in and he couldn't. And he wrote back and said, well, he went to the last measure of his devotion as far as he could take it. And he made the conditions possible to destroy the ring. But he considered that there would be a battle with a ring wraith, and in the battle, the ring would fall into the crack of doom, which is a phrase from Shakespeare, oddly. And he also considered that Gollum would steal the ring, and then he developed so much admiration for Frodo that he himself would voluntarily jump in. And then he kind of went, nah, Frodo's not redeemed enough to do that.
Yeah.
So even as he's writing this huge epic, he hasn't decided how it's going to end while he's writing it. That's an amazing kind of confidence in your artistic process to be able to do that.
But I like what Dr. Ryken is saying about the inevitability. It's almost a theological inevitability that he inscribes into the ending rather than a narrative inevitability. And people who are expecting the cliche happy ending are expecting Frodo to be the hero. And life is too complex in Tolkien's mind, and it should be more complex for all of us. Things do not work out the way we anticipate.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to think about if he had chosen one of those alternate endings, whether the book would have had the staying power that it has. I mean, there's a lot. It's not just the ending. There's so many other aspects of the book that are compelling, but that's part of it. And and by the way, for those who are listening to this podcast and just hearing Doctors Downing, in talking about Tolkien. This is the kind of expertise that you can benefit from when you come as a researcher. Great conversation partners here at Wheaton College at the Wade Center to advance your own work.
Well, how could we possibly go on after that? That is a wonderful closing comment. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ryken.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciated your insights. Thanks for joining us.